What's going on, everybody? I'm James Young with jamesyoungphotography.com, and this is Teach Me How to Lightroom. Today we're honing in and we're talking split toning. We're talking about exactly how to use it and how to harness the power so that you can improve your editing workflow with Lightroom. Now, with this example image, you can see that I already have some settings dialed in for split toning. So you can see that I have used split toning without making my image look absolutely terrible. But for this lesson, we're going to actually just take everything off and talk about each one of these sliders one by one. Now, we have three main sections. We have highlights, balance, and shadows. We're going to start by talking about highlights and shadows, and these directly correlate with the histogram. So when we're modifying the sliders within the highlights, we're talking about the brighter side of the color spectrum. And conversely, with the shadows, we're going to be modifying the darker tones within our color spectrum or within our exposure found in the image. Now, when we're talking balance, this is just going to change the amount of effect, whether to the highlights or to the shadows, but we're going to get to that in just a little bit. Now, whether we're talking highlights or we're talking shadows, these two sliders do the same thing, just to their respective side of the histogram. When we're modifying the hue, or better yet, selecting the hue, we're actually choosing what color we're literally going to inject into the highlights. Now, every single color represented on the spectrum is assigned a numeric value here on the right. Alternatively, you can press this little rectangle here. This is actually going to open up a color swatch, and you can select what shade of whatever color you want. It will then give you the numeric value represented. I'm just going to go ahead and click X on that because that is merely a graph version of the sliders. It really is just a visual representation of the two sliders that are represented here. Now, just to really show this effect, we're going to go at about 233 here. That's kind of some colder tones, and we're affecting the highlights here, and highlights would comprise a lot of the skin tones in most scenarios and things like that. So you're really going to see a lot of this effect take place within our skin tones, kind of within these bokeh areas here, and even in the cement here as well. Now, with the saturation, that tells us the amount of color we're going to inject. So with the hue, we're deciding what color, and with the saturation, we're deciding to what extent. Now, to demonstrate, I'm just going to crank this all the way to the right to show you what it's doing. Now, this is by no means necessarily a practical application. This is merely just to show you what is taking place. So we'll move on down to our shadows, and we'll select maybe a warmer tone somewhere around 50 or so. 51's fine. And then with our saturation, we're going to crank that all the way up to 100 as well. And so now you can see this beautiful image has been totally over split tone, but it is merely to show you what is taking place when we're modifying the sliders within the split toning. So now let's focus our attention back to this balance slider, because we can actually see what it's doing now that we have some split toning adjustments already made. So like I said before, when you slide it to the right, it's going to give more effect to the highlights than the shadows. And the same will take place if you slide it to the left, except it will inject more into the shadows versus the highlights. So it's basically just another level of fine-tuning within the split toning. And of course, you would use that at your own discretion. So I'm going to go ahead and reset all these values here and use split toning in a practical way for this particular image. Now, what I'm going to do here is on highlights, I'm going to go to around 45-ish or so. There we go. And then on saturation, we're really just doing a small touch. Let's do about 2. And you can see when I turn off the effect and I turn it back on, it is incredibly subtle. Then with shadows, we're also going to do kind of a warmer tone, somewhere around 65 or so. There we go. And then saturation here, we're going to hit it with a little bit more saturation, but not a ton. So you can see here, when we turn it off and we turn it back on, it is a pretty subtle effect, but it is nice. Now, let's say I went a little too heavy on the shadows, but I want to give it a little bit more on the highlights. So I'm just going to bring my balance over to the right, about 70. There we go. So then let's turn off split toning. Let's turn it back on. And you can see that the image is much warmer from using split toning. The reason why I would want to do that, instead of just taking the temperature slider here up at the top and just cranking it to the right, is because I can really fine tune the amount of warmth being injected into what side of the histogram. Whereas with the temperature slider, I'm only going to get that one layer of control. Let's scroll back down. Some other things you can do with the split toning is where you get that cinematic effect where you would put orange into the highlights and you would put cooler tones like a teal into the shadows. I'm going to take my balance back down here, bring down our saturation quite a bit there. Let's make it even cooler in the shadows. And even more orange in our highlights. Then I'll crank up my warmth just a little bit. And you get more of that cinematic look. So I'm going to undo all that, go back to where I was with the warmer look. And you can see, bam, two different options on how to use split toning right there and how to use it. Now, naturally, what you're going to want to do is more of a subtle effect with your split toning. You don't really want to crank it all the way to 100, do something like that. You're obviously going to want to use discretion with this new tool in your toolbox. But that is how to use split toning in a nutshell. So if you learned something today, you liked the video, it would be awesome if you left a like on it. And if this is your first video with us here today, I would love it if you left a subscribe on our channel so you can come back and check out more videos in the future. Well, I'm James Young with JamesYoungPhotography.com, and this is Teach Me How to Lightroom.